Good morning, everyone. And yes, we are being recorded. It's very nice to see you. My name is Deborah Harrington. I'm the Dean for Student Success for the LA Community College District, and I'm a joyful conspirator with Tatiana and crew. USC has supported LACCD for it's well over a decade. I think we're going on to almost 15 years. And the primary focus really has been, how do we help our students' journey? How do we particularly focus on that journey through to completing math and English in a timely manner? And also just some really, to me, what I value the most is the whole idea of researchers partnering with practitioners, really looking at data, and also really appreciating and supporting faculty as they make changes to better serve our students. And so USC has been instrumental in partnerships with folks from colleges like Pierce, who have gone on to really do, I think, some really phenomenal work, particularly in the areas of math. So thank you, USC, for being such a great partner all these years. And I am not going to give you a long introduction of our chancellor, except to say that I've been at the district, as you all know, for a really long time. I've gone through a number of chancellors, but this is the chancellor who has mostly held, more than anybody else, that banner for equity and excellence, and understands practitioners because he was and continues to be one himself. So it's really my honor and privilege to introduce our Chancellor, Francisco Rodriguez. Who needs to unmute himself? It's Zoom. Let's see.
There we go. There we go. Thank you so much. Muy buenos dias and good afternoon or good morning to everybody. Pardon me. Really nice to see everyone. Thank you, Deborah, Dr. Harrington, for that kind introduction. I appreciate the opportunity this morning to share a few words to begin today's convening and the wonderful gathering of colleagues from USC, UCLA, LACCD, and other institutions on this salient topic of examining the impact of AB 705 implementation at our LACCD colleges, and most importantly, on the academic outcomes of our students. We view AB 705 as a policy with the potential to support and accelerate our collective vision for LACCD as it relates to providing high quality education while championing equity, inclusion, diversity, and outreach to under-resourced communities. At LACCD, as was said earlier, we strive to be at the intersection of opportunity, equity, and academic excellence. It's not an overstatement to declare that this landmark legislation ushered in a period of transformation for the California community college system that fundamentally changed the way our students are placed into English, math, and ESL courses and enroll in college level coursework. National data and national models have demonstrated that direct placement and transfer level coursework increases the likelihood of student achievement. So our institutions had a sober awakening in the same way that AB 705 recognizes that the pre-existing remedial pathways had been largely unsuccessful at community colleges, and that students of color and under-resourced students have been particularly penalized, harmed, and impacted by the placement and remediation processes that have been commonly used for decades. The provisions of AB 705 that immediately eliminated high-stakes student placement were central towards the redesign of our processes and the recalibration, frankly, of our mindset about student outcomes. From my standpoint, the historical burden of failure placed on the student necessarily and rightly shifted to the institution. So we got to work. At LACCD, implementation of AB 705 in English and math has been a consistent focus across the district for several years now. And many of the colleagues who have been instrumental to that are on this call, and you'll hear from them. There have been joint efforts in collaboration with the District Academic Senate, with the academic senates at our colleges, with the math and English departments, with faculty, administrators, and staff to work collectively to design new curriculum, revise placement processes, fund pilot projects and innovative approaches, and create new models to support student success. We have also maintained our commitment, I'm happy to share this, to hire full-time tenure track faculty and staff in these key disciplines and in other support units. So, colleagues, today's gathering is timely and relevant. As has been shared before, I'm aware that this research project is one of many that have been done with USC under the leadership of Dr. Tatiana Melguizo. First starting around 2008, as I understand. Dr. Melguizo, Tatiana started working with us to look at how our students were faring through, in particular, the DevEd math sequence. So thank you, and to our USC colleagues for the respect that you have displayed in working closely with us, with our faculty, in understanding our points of view, and in helping us link to opportunities for practitioners like us to participate in the research and to use this research to inform our teaching and learning praxis. The review of research and data that quantitatively evaluates the impact of AB 705 on student outcomes is an important milestone for LACCD and provides for us, frankly, a gut check. What have we discovered thus far after our first year of implementing AB 705? Did AB 705 mandated use of multiple measures for placement and the practice of encouraging students to enroll in additional supports translate to higher rates of throughput in English and math? How or have our practices, attitudes, and expectations changed? These are weighty questions with answers of great consequence. And this gathering helps us translate this research to our practice, to what we do in and outside of the classroom to boost student achievement, which is our goal, our North Star. So there are still many, many questions to be asked and answered, curricular, programmatic, and fiscal, that will require a continued and focused collegial consultation. And I thank compañero, hermano, Dean Pedro Noguera for his long-standing leadership and insight on these issues, and our USC and UCLA colleagues for your continued support and your guidance. What is clear is that we must design and deliver on an improved model geared to improve student success in English and math. Students expect and deserve this. So together, I am confident that we can and will indeed do this. So thank you all for your kind attention, and I'm looking forward to an enjoyable and productive gathering. So gracias. Un fuerte abrazo.
Thank you so much for getting us started, for collaborating with us, for supporting the partnership. We are so proud and helpful to work with all of you. It is my privilege now to introduce Dean Noguera. Dr. Pedro Noguera is the Emeritus Stoops and Joyce Stoops Dean of the Rosier School of Education and a distinguished professor of education at the University of Southern California. As we know, he's the author of multiple books, and the most recent books are A Search for Common Ground, Conversations about the Toughest Questions in K through 12, and City Schools and the American Dream, Still Pursuing the Dream. It's on behalf of the RPP team members, I would like to welcome you and to thank you for supporting the partnership and for taking the time today to open the 4th yearly RPP convening. Welcome.
Thank you, Tatiana, and good morning to all of you. It's really great to be part of this gathering. Thank you, Chancellor Rodriguez, for convening us, and I just want to really commend my colleague, Professor Melguizo, and the work that she and her colleagues at Pullius have been doing to support this research practice partnership. I'm particularly happy to see my former colleagues at UCLA in this work, because there's plenty for all of us to do, and collaboration, the spirit of collaboration, is, I think, something that we want to continue to reinforce. Our community colleges are so critical to educational opportunity. We know that for years, it's been the starting point for access to higher education for many people across this country, but particularly here in LA. And right now, with so many of the colleges experiencing a decline in enrollment, I think it's critical that we start to ask questions, fundamental questions, about what we must do differently to allow our colleges to adapt to the changing circumstances. Because we know that many students right now are under severe pressure to work and are choosing work over education. We know that that choice, while it might be practically necessary, may have long-term adverse consequences in terms of lower employment, income and fewer opportunities, because we continue to see the evidence, access to higher ed, getting a good college education is essential to higher earnings later on. So how do we make sure that our colleges, community colleges, are able to respond to the needs of our students at this particular point in our history? I think the research practice partnership that we've launched here and that we're continuing to build is essential, because when we have good research to guide what we're doing in these institutions, it allows us to be more responsive and more effective at meeting their needs. I will also say, from having worked on this for many years myself, change is always hard, and changing the institutions so they can be more responsive is not easy. But I think that if we're in this together and we're doing work that is meaningful and useful in terms of the research, that we can bring about the changes that are required. So I'm delighted to see this work happening. I'm delighted to support it. We've been thinking about how to continue to do this work, particularly linking our K-12 school districts with community colleges so that we have more robust connections, and so that together we can make Los Angeles a center for educational opportunity to address the tremendous needs in this region. So thank you all for your work. Thank you for your efforts. Tatiana, thank you for your leadership. And unfortunately, as is often the case, I have another meeting right now at the same time that I'll have to leave, so I won't be able to participate, but I'm glad I was able to see you all this morning. So keep up the good work, and thanks again.
Thank you so much, Dean Noguera. Thank you for taking the time, and we'll move forward. So again, I have been a faculty member at the Rosier School of Education for all my academic career, and I had the privilege of working with the Los Angeles Community College leaders and faculty for, as Deborah said, over almost 15 years. So it is a pleasure to welcome everyone to the 4th RPP Research Convening on behalf of my research partners from the LACCD, USC Puglia Center for Higher Education, University of Nevada, Las Vegas, the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and the Center for Education Policy Research at Harvard University. So for those of you who are attending the convening for the first time, let me begin by stating that the partnership strives to understand institutional barriers that are common in developmental education, document their consequences, and work with educators to change practice. Our work has provided, as our Chancellor Rodriguez said, compelling, rigorous evidence documenting that placing students in a long sequence of developmental courses or the prerequisite model is detrimental to students' learning and completion of math and English transfer level courses. We coined the term intersector misalignment to illustrate how the previous assessment and placement and prerequisite model was discounting student progress and achievement in high school, and we empirically demonstrated how this intersector misalignment disproportionately affected racially minoritized students, English language learners, and pushed STEM aspiring students off a STEM track. Our research was part of a nationwide research effort and has contributed evidence that resulted in groundbreaking legislation throughout the country. The result has been a move away from the placement towards multiple measures and from the DEVED prerequisite model towards enrolling students directly in transfer level math and English courses with different levels of academic support. For the past 3 years, the team has collaborated on a funded grant from the Spencer Foundation to conduct a mixed method evaluation of AB 705 implementation. The main goal of the convening is to present and reflect on some of the main findings, and keep in mind that we're focusing on AB 705, but we're giving the opportunity to also reflect on AB 1705. So with that, introduction for the work that has been done at the RPP, let me introduce the agenda. We're going to start with 2 research presentations summarizing the key findings. Dr. Frederick No will present the results of the paper entitled Mandating Multiple Measures and Encouraging Student Support, Evaluating a New Approach to Developmental Education in California Community College. Dr. Cheryl Sheen will present results from the paper entitled The Logics That Keep Developmental Education Alive in an Age of Reform. We proceed with a moderated discussion by Dr. Deborah Harrington to reflect on the advantages and challenges of engaging in these partnerships. And as panelists, we have LACCD's interim vice chancellor, Dr. Nicole Albo Lopez, LA Pierce Math Department Chair, Professor Ed Cherchen, West LA College English Department Chair, Professor Claire Norris, and it's an honor to have Professor Jim Stigler, who also has a long history of partnering with faculty in the district, and myself. We then have Dr. Elise Swanson, who would briefly describe 2 new research projects that receive federal funding and that would be the focus of the RPP for the following 3 years. In closing, Dr. Deborah Harrington and myself will offer some final reflections. So as we continue to the presentations, let me kind of remind you that you can pose questions directly to the presenter and panelists in the chat. Thank you so much. Welcome, everyone. And Frederick, I'll pass it to you.
Morning, everyone. Actually, Tatiana, I think people can't chat, so I'm going to turn on the, I'm just going to enable the chat for now. I may not be able to look at the chat while I'm doing the presentation, so I'm going to ask Elif to summarize any questions towards the end. But again, thank you all for coming. We're excited to host this convening again. I'm also excited to see a couple of my students from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, where I'm an assistant professor. They are also community college practitioners and enrolled in graduate program in higher education. And Nevada, much like California, is also engaging in a pretty substantial developmental education reform. And so I think there's a lot of exciting and important things happening all over the West Coast and Northwest. So the main objective of the study I want to talk about today is to quantitatively evaluate the impact of AB 705 on academic outcomes. And specifically, we're looking at the 2 main features of the policy and how they relate to student outcomes. So the use of multiple measures for placement, and also the practice of encouraging students to enroll in additional supports, such as tutoring, supplemental instruction, co-requisites, etc. And we have data here to talk about both English and math. So I'll skip over this because I think Tatiana summarized well kind of how California's narrative fits into the broader national landscape of developmental education reform. But AB 705 specifically highlights these 2 policy features, which is requiring the use of multiple measures for placement, such as high school GPA and then prior math and English course taking. It has the goal of maximizing the likelihood that students enter and complete transfer level courses within 1 year, which we all affectionately know as throughput. And in doing so, this led to the reduction of transfer level courses, developmental courses, and also the increasing introduction of various support courses. These are some figures from a report we did over 2 years ago when we got the first round of data from LACCD, just descriptively showing that indeed, if you look at just entering cohorts in the fall, 17, 18, 19, substantially more students did enroll in transfer level math and English. So you can just see the clear trend upward there. You can also see a clear trend upwards in the number of students completing transfer level math and English. And this is just after 1 semester of implementation before COVID issues began to affect the way that we did teaching and learning. So I note these here because they offer a bird's eye view of what's happened across the district, descriptively, the change over time, in student outcomes, particularly throughput. What we're interested in for this particular study is identifying the causal impact of the specific features of the policy and the changes that were made. So what was the impact of multiple measures placement? And what was the impact of these making recommendations that students enroll in various support courses? In our world, Tatiana and I, like we're interested in these causal impact questions. What is the causal effect of introducing certain policy, introducing certain legislation, the causal effect of different practices that go on in higher education? And so we draw from the economics of education world and use what are called quasi-experimental methods to try to identify the impact, because we want to know not just what was like the overall trend, we want to be able to say for sure like how much a particular policy or practice led to changes in student outcomes. So with the partnership of the district, this study focuses and uses data from the first two cohorts, fall 2019, and for the first year of implementation of AB 705. This particular study is going to focus on the 31,000 students who had their high school GPA information, received like a placement recommendation, and then we will track them and examine their 1 year throughput. The main approach we're using is what's called a regression discontinuity design. Intuitively, or the intuition for this is that because there's a cutoff, we can compare students essentially right above the cutoff to students right below, because the cutoff has created different treatments or like different experiences for the student. So cutoffs are used all the time in education, just because we often need to make administrative decisions, often based on test scores or GPA, for example. And the intuition for the RD is that there's measurement error in tests and the different measures that we use to place students. And for example, like a student may one day have gotten a certain score on a placement test, but the next day in another sitting may have gotten 1 point higher. So like there's some degree of error in this, this measurement tool. And so when we use those kinds of measures to assign students to different courses or different experiences in education, we can claim that it is the treatment itself that led to the change in outcomes, the difference in outcomes. So in this graph here, you can see that students who, for example, scored right below the cutoff for the arithmetic versus pre-algebra placement cutoff had a jump or a discontinuity in their outcomes. And you can infer then that it was the treatment or being placed in arithmetic instead of pre-algebra that is causing the change in their outcomes. So what does this look like now under the AB 705 context? This is an example of the English cutoffs from the fall 2019 cohort, where, you know, depending on the GPA you received, students, depending on the GPA that you earned, students receive kind of different messaging, right? And in the gist of it is, the lower the GPA, the more strongly the recommendation to enroll in these different support courses. And so this is a slightly different scenario from what I described with like the developmental education placement, where you were forced to enroll in, you know, lower level courses versus the upper level courses based on your placement test score. This is at a certain GPA cutoff, you receive these recommendations. So the treatment really is receiving certain types of recommendations. So the encouragement to enroll in support courses. So I can link the full paper, which goes through all the technical details of this design, but this visual I think shows what we found. which is at the upper cutoff, 2.6, you don't really see a big jump between students' throughput above and below the cutoff, right? So we could infer then that there was no harm, there was no negative effect of receiving a recommendation to enroll in a support course. However, at the lower cutoff, this is the 1.9 cutoff, you can see that just to the left of the cutoff, students actually had slightly higher probability of achieving throughput in English. So all we can really infer from that is that something is happening at that 1.9 cutoff that actually is helping students right below the cutoff, help them earn slightly even higher throughput than students to the right of the cutoff. So all we can say is something's happening there that looks promising. Math was a slightly more complicated research task, just because there's so many different, there's more, the policy is less clear than English, right? We have the BSTEM and the SLAM pathways. We have not only GPA being used as a placement metric, but also high school math course taking. So it creates lots of different groups that are hard to compare. But we did our best to try to identify some cleaner groups that we could compare using the RD design. Because the recommendations are still very similar, which is the lower the GPA, the more recommendations were made in terms of support courses you could enroll in. And in math, it's important to note that the recommendations were both enrolling in concurrent support courses, such as like co-requisites, or developmental courses. When we plot the data in an RD framework, we can see that there really is no clear jump or discontinuity in outcomes. Our inference here is that the recommendations made for those below the cutoff were effective in helping those students achieve roughly equivalent outcomes to those just above the cutoff. So you see there's like the gray is smooth through the cutoff. And again, with the full paper, it has results for all the other different cutoffs. Okay, so the story so far is that something is happening around these cutoffs, particularly the English cutoffs, that is helping students. So then we know that what happened at the cutoffs is some recommendations were made for students to enroll in different support courses. So we looked through the data and found all the students who had actually followed the recommendation. So this graph shows by high school GPA, the share of students who actually followed the recommendations and enrolled in the support courses in English. So you can see that, yeah, as the GPA declines for lower GPAs, more students did enroll in the recommended supports. Not everyone, and not really more than 20%, but there is some evidence that people are following these recommendations. In math, it's a slightly different story. More students enrolled in the developmental courses at lower GPA bins as compared to the concurrent math supports. So they're following recommendations, but the recommendations are somewhat different. So in trying to identify the impact of these recommendations, we used a matching strategy. And the issue here is that students, ultimately, they're choosing to enroll in those courses or not. So we're trying our best to model the student's choice to enroll in a recommended support course in math and English. So the best we can do here is to match students based on their GPA, their demographic background, whether they receive financial aid, what their placement level was, the campus they're in, the term they're in. So essentially, we're trying to compare apples to like very similar apples. and see what the difference in their outcomes is for the students who did and did not enroll in the recommended support course. Okay, so I guess the lighter blue bars are the students who did follow the recommendations, and the navy blue bars are students are academically and demographically similar students who did not follow the recommendations. So in the data, we did not see that they enrolled in English 72, for example. And so actually the picture looks very promising for English. It seems like students who did follow the recommendations had significantly higher probability of achieving throughput than their peers who did not. In math, so for math, we broke it down into the concurrent and the developmental courses. Students who followed who enrolled in the recommended concurrent courses, such as co-recs, had slightly higher outcomes, but this is not statistically different. But in math, we see that students who chose to enroll in the developmental courses did have significantly lower outcomes in terms of throughput. Okay. So how do we make sense of all this? I think overall, we can say that these two strategies, mandating multiple measures and encouraging student supports, appears to be effective. There is suggestive evidence here that the concurrent supports are supporting students in English and perhaps to some extent in math. And this matches and corroborates the story emerging in other systems and states, such as CUNY, Texas, etc. Waiting on the Nevada data and trying to figure that out. And I think it also shows that following the recommendation to enroll in developmental math was not as helpful for academically and demographically similar students. So I think as we try to make sense of what are the implications of this study, I think it seems to be that we can bolster and support the development of these courses, these support courses, and such as co-requisite courses. And I think the questions, given the low take-up, how do we encourage students to enroll in these courses, and also what is effective in these courses that is helping students to achieve oftentimes higher outcomes and better outcomes than the students that are not enrolling in the support courses. Okay, so I will post a link for the full paper if you want to take a look at it. And I think we have a little bit of time for some questions.
So Frederick, I think there's a question in the chat about, can you explain the control group, what the control group was for the Dev Math group?
Yeah, so in each of the matching comparisons, we found students who had similar incoming GPA. So we matched on GPA, matched on demographic variables, so race, gender. We matched on placement level and campus. So essentially it's students kind of in the same boat, so to speak, but we can observe in the data that some followed the placement recommendations that were made to them and some did not. So those are the two groups. Are we matching on everything possible? No, we're limited kind of by what variables exist in the data.
Great. I think for those of you who have questions, if you can put them in the chat, that would be good. It's how we're doing it for this for the webinar. So there's another question, like how much of the math results could be attributable to the systemic / affective roadblock of, quote, I hate math, or I'm not a math person?
How much of math results could be attributable to the systemic affective roadblock of I hate math? Right. So if in an ideal world, we would have that variable and match on that variable, so that we could also compare another level of similarity between students, right? So not just similar high school GPA or similar financial aid status, but also similar math affect. That is not a question we can answer with the quantitative data that we're using. Again, this is like a broad, this is more like a bird's eye view across the entire district, and not getting into like the psychosocial aspects of students' experiences.
Yeah, and there's one a little further up about looking at in terms of outcomes, like you looked at throughput rates, but did your analysis also include course success rates in addition?
Yeah, in the full paper, we also looked at like credits completed and attempted subsequently.
Okay, cool, excellent.
That one's a little tricky for credits completed or attempted. It's a little trickier because by design, when you enroll in support courses, most of them offer additional credits, so you're going to earn more.
All right, so there's a question also about the control group, and is this the group of folks that didn't follow the recommendations?
According to what we see in the transcript data, they did not enroll in the list of courses that were recommended in their placement messaging.
Okay, there's a question here. Do we know from the data, like for students who did not enroll in any dev math, did they enroll in transfer level courses, or I suppose didn't enroll at all, which I suppose would be another pathway?
Can you say that again?
It says, what did math students do who did not enroll in developmental math? Did they enroll in transfer level courses?
Presumably, yes.
Okay.
I mean, again, like there may be some. All we can see from like our, me sitting in my computer is what course students enrolled in. In the end, we don't really know about the process by which that happened. Like what was the nature of their conversation with a counselor or with a faculty member? Like what exactly led to that? All I can see is what you were recommended to do and what you ended up doing.
Okay, so there's one from Michael Hopper. You mentioned that there's a breakdown by campus in your working paper. So this would be a great secondary school experience in different areas, different parts of LACCD service areas and such.
Actually, for this paper, there's not a breakdown by campus. The reason for that is the RD design and matching as well. Like you kind of need larger sample sizes to be able to have more confidence in the inferences you're making. So, for RD, you're looking at essentially the students who earned a 2.4, 2.5 versus 2.6, 2.7. So when you whittle it down, you have a much fewer observations. So you can make a stronger case when you're looking across the whole of the district and you have a larger sample size. But yeah, I think, building off of some of the work that Tatiana mentioned in her remarks, like we have had access previously to LAUSD data, and I think it actually is really important to expand this work, continue that work, like looking at the transition between LAUSD schools and other districts into the LACCD.
I mean, I guess a sort of follow-up to that then is, I'm thinking like if you're sitting on a campus, like having the district level bird's eye view is super helpful. But if you think about, each campus, as some of the comments are suggesting, are, they're unique, right? Like they pull from potentially different high schools and such. Like, is there a way to do, I guess, like a congruent or parallel kind of analysis to what you've done, even if it doesn't meet the kind of technical specifications of the matching and the RD? Like what can institutional researchers perhaps do, using the data that they have for their own campuses to see, to replicate something of this study, even if it doesn't meet the threshold, the technical thresholds of the analytic strategy?
I mean, yeah, I think at the very least, it's important to get all of the descriptive trend data out there about changes in student outcomes. And then I think it's partnerships like this help to bring other kinds of analyses into the conversation. Sorry, there's so many questions.
I know, there's a lot of interest, I think, in the analysis that you've done. There's
Using
something
the
about,
1 year throughput.
Mhm.
Yeah, we use the 1 year throughput rate. Yeah, I think that is a conversation that we have had a lot. Like, is throughput the best metric to use? We used it just because, as people trying to analyze a state policy, that is the metric that they have stated. But certainly, yeah, you would get kind of you could come to maybe some different or more nuanced conclusions if you looked at different metrics.
Does the full paper include breakdown in terms of, let's say, the students who took stats, so sort of the BSLAM and BSTEM and then the SLAM pathways? Does it split that way in the full paper?
Not this paper, but we have a separate paper that's still in progress looking at differences in student enrollment and outcomes by the SLAM and BSTEM pathways.
So
I don't think that's ready to share yet, though.
Okay, cool. So I think we've got one more, I think. It says, I think math, quote unquote, math concurrent and math developmental with the subcategories being enrolled in support and control is potentially confusing. Yeah, if you have any kind of additional clarity around
Sure,
those
yeah, let me
categories.
talk through that one more time. Just that is kind of the important takeaway here. So students, depending on their incoming GPA, received a message. That message included what courses you are recommended to take. So for example, in English, I didn't put the math ones here because it's very large and convoluted. But for example, here, if you had a 2.6 or higher, you just enroll in 101, or you can enroll in 101. But here you can see in the blue, people who got a 2.5 got this additional recommendation. You're strongly advised to enroll in English 72. This is a concurrent support course. So that's the context there. But as you can see, it's just a recommendation or an advisement to do that. So we could look in our data and see who actually did that, who actually followed through on the recommendation. In English, for example, here, of the students who earned a 1.9, about 15% actually did enroll in English 72. This chart, this figure, compares the students the 15% who did to the 85% essentially who did not follow the recommendation. And those who did, after 1 year, were much more likely to achieve throughput in English. I hope that clarifies the design.
Okay, so I think we may need to move on to my presentation, but I think there'll be opportunities to ask more questions, and maybe we can collect them and sort of respond to them offline.
Yeah. Thank you so much for all these questions. We'll definitely compile them and think about how to respond to them.
Okay, great.
So I will pass it over to Cheryl now. We're tag teaming here.
Yeah. So hi, everyone. Good morning. So I'm on the East Coast, so it's good afternoon for me, but good morning for everyone else. So I'm going to present on some of the qualitative work that we've done as part of this project. So I want to make sure that what you're seeing right now is, please someone shout out if what you're seeing is my notes rather than like the full slide. So as Tatiana said, so the title for this paper is The Logics That Keep Developmental Education Alive in an Age of Reform. And we got to this question in part because we did a district-wide survey. Some of you in the room may have participated in it. This was about in spring of 2021. And from that survey, what we saw was there was a lot of change that was made. There was pretty high compliance. I know there's some kind of questioning about whether there was compliance and not based on other reports. But from what we saw and what was reported from our respondents, there's a lot of changes made in response to AB 705 around advising, the curricular structure, developmental education, implementing support courses, and various other things. And so, that showed us that basically, mandates work, in a way, and change is happening, like people respond to them. There was large familiarity with the AB 705 goals. But the thing that was really interesting to us is that we also in that survey asked a number of questions around, practitioner beliefs. And so one of them, in spite of all this change that was happening, there was particularly around, we asked like the math and English faculty who have a lot of responsibility for implementing AB 705, like what they still thought about developmental education, co-requisite courses, et cetera. And at least as of spring 2021, like we had, the survey showed us that there continued to be a lot of adherence and desire for below transfer level courses, like our developmental education courses. And so for us, this was just a question that we really wanted to unpack and untangle as a way of understanding where instructors, perhaps in particular, but practitioners generally are with developmental education. And, the motivation, in addition to, kind of noticing and observing this from the district survey data, is, coming, sort of believing that, in order for reform and policies to really be impactful and transformative, we really need to take seriously where practitioners are. And so if there continues to be a real commitment to developmental education courses, a belief that they're effective, then it's important to understand, the how and the why of that. So this analysis was a way of trying to interrogate what those questions are, and with the idea that we could provide some recommendations, particularly for policymakers and reformers in terms of learning, for their learning, so that they can better support folks like on campuses who are responsible for carrying out and doing this work. So what I'm going to do, like over the course of the presentation, is basically talk about our case study sites, a little bit about the participants, as well as show you some of the findings and why we took this kind of idea around logics. So as part of the work that we did over the last couple of years, we did a number of college case studies, like 3 colleges in particular, like that were part of LACCD. And what we found from that when we did interviews, like we largely looked at documents that were related to AB 705 implementation, but we also interviewed a number of practitioners, participants, like who were involved with implementing AB 705. So that could have been, administrators, like some faculty members, like department chairs, et cetera, at these 3 colleges. We also interviewed like folks at the district office, but they're not included as part of this analysis. And so what we found out from our interview results is that they basically confirmed our survey results. So, sort of, I'll have a slide like later down the line that shows like where our participants were in terms of their perspectives on AB 705. And, basically the foreshadowing is that there was a range, like some loved it and some thought like it was a disaster. But even across all of that, even for the folks who, celebrated AB 705, like coming down the pike, most of the practitioners that we spoke to expressed like some desire and some need for these DevEd courses to stay. So in some ways, basically our interviews like sort of mapped on to the district survey results that we got. And so what we're doing for this analysis is, so we took, again, we focused on 24 of the interviews of, campus practitioners. Our first research question was really to look at, again, like what was, the view of AB 705. And then sorry.
You haven't shared your thing.
Oh, I haven't shared. Oh my goodness, sorry. Apologies for that. Let me do this. Okay, and then let me get into presentation mode. Okay, apologies for that. So everyone can see the full slides, right? Excellent. All right, so I didn't get into all the details, all the kind of juicy details yet. So hopefully that wasn't too much of a technical snafu. So our second research question was looking into, again, what were the logics or sort of rationales that practitioners invoked when talking about developmental education? So those were the two research questions that we sought to investigate in our analysis. And so why are we even doing, like, what is this sort of idea around logics? I think what was really interesting in reading the interviews and talking with folks is that there was a lot of kind of invocation, like not just of developmental education courses, like in really practical terms. Like there was often this sort of, let's say, for example, kind of thinking about dev ed within the context of a community college and seeing that as part of one of the ways that community colleges fulfills its like open access mission. And so what that signaled to us on the team was that there were kind of these broader sort of ideals that were being shared as part of the reasons why dev ed, should stay. And so logics, like as a framework, as, sort of a set of ideas, helps us like kind of make sense of like how micro, kind of campus, kind of on the ground realities, like hook onto broader kind of even like societal level ideas like democracy, opportunity. And so for us, this was just an analytic device to help us kind of think about, people's beliefs around developmental education. And again, as to trying to understand like why, the desire remained, for these courses. Okay, so next slide. So here we have, so again, we spoke to 24 people. And they kind of had the range of faculty, staff, and administrators, but the kind of through line through all of them was that they all had some direct involvement in implementing and designing their college's response to AB 705. And as you can see, and this is, as of spring 2021. So, right, we're sort of a year and a half now. So but this is, sort of 2 years into, or, kind of 4 semesters into full implementation of AB 705. What we're seeing is really quite a range. And that range existed at most of the colleges, or like at least at most of the colleges where we are at, like around the 3. And you see, like on one hand, again, there were folks who really thought AB 705 was like this great opportunity, whether it was for students, whether it was to change how their college was doing things. There were folks that were sort of in the middle, that kind of were like, well, we have to see how the data bear things out. And so they were less, willing to kind of share whether they were all for the policy or not. And then there were folks like who were, I would, we would say like that were more negative around AB 705 and kind of saw it as making things worse, whether that was like for their students, like for their ability to, to teach, et cetera. And I guess another thing to point out is that the instructors who we spoke with tended to be a little more negative around AB 705 than positive. But there is, again, a kind of range, as you can see on these slides. So how did we even start to figure out, like, sort of this idea around the logics? And so, as we do as researchers, we go into the literature to try and understand, where did this idea of developmental education even come from? And one of the things that we discovered in doing all this reading and research is that, there's been some form of college preparation or, what we could loosely call developmental education ever since the colonial colleges. So like even Harvard had some version of college preparatory programming. And so this sort of gave us this idea that, there's sort of this longstanding like sense that, between, students who kind of complete whatever the kind of secondary schooling is, and as they transition to college, like there has always generally been a need over time to sort of bridge whatever those gaps are. What we also learned from the scholarship is that there are a range of reasons for why that might be sometimes, and they're sort of listed here on the left-hand side. It could be around a desire to ensure that students are up to the college standards, like college level standards. There's sort of ideas around, like K-12 education is generally like it's not providing students or not offering students like with the opportunities to learn that they should be getting. And so there's a need to compensate for those gaps, again, once students get to college. There's a lot of rationales around opportunity. There's also a sense of, we need developmental education so that students have their building blocks in order to then go into the labor force, down the line. And there's also been this sort of notion that, students may want to choose to do some college preparation so that they're better prepared. So they kind of have this self-choice. So that's sort of what we had on the left-hand side. And these were some of the rationales that we discerned from existing scholarship. And we mapped on our participants' responses. And you can see that, most of them had there's some evidence of, our participants sort of shared that, a number of these rationales. But what was also striking to us was the student choice piece was a big, was one of the reasons why our participants felt that there needs to be some developmental education course. So if students felt that they wanted that, they should have the ability to choose that. We also discerned a couple of rationales that weren't part of the literature. And so one of them is that, faculty should have the right, or they have through the 10+1, they're in charge of the curriculum. And so the decisions to eliminate developmental courses like the AB 705 sort of shrinking the ground upon which developmental education courses can have to stand, that should not be under the purview of anyone but the faculty. There was a lot of talk around the kind of open access mission of the community college, which I referred to earlier. There was also, again, some kind of, a sharing around that the reason why DevEd needs to stay is because, it provides those foundational skills that students will need in subsequent courses. And then there was also this kind of sense that, eliminating developmental education could eventually harm students down the line, negatively impacting their learning and their well-being and their, their pathway through college. In part, that was because it could potentially, and I'll show some quotes later, they could potentially shame students. If you don't have DevEd, that it might tell them then maybe, if I need to build my skills, I can't even come here. So there's a sort of signaling effect, whether there is or isn't DevEd offered at a college. So, we had a number of these rationales. And so we kind of had to think about how do we make sense of all of this sort of disparate information and how might they hang together? And so the work that we did was to kind of, again, figure out how they do hang together. And so we, as part of our analysis, we came to thinking that, maybe there were three underlying logics that sort of animated a number of these rationales. And depending on the time that we have, but I'm happy to answer any questions about any of the logics, I'll kind of go through the three of them. So one, the first logic, the one in the orange, is really around, thinking about that, there is this kind of idea that developmental education provides students with this basic educational competency. Again, that idea that we need this, or students need this in order to do well in subsequent courses. There was this logic that, DevEd is part of what the community college does to uphold educational opportunity. And the final logic is around, who gets to decide, what kind of DevEd is offered and who gets to, take it. And should that be the student? Should that be the faculty? So the next couple of slides, we have some quotes and as well as sort of talking in a little more depth about the features of each of these logics. So thinking about the first one, again, we had a number of quotes that sort of talked about, again, sort of thinking in the K-12 schooling, really has denied students this opportunity to develop English and math skills. And basically it's if the community colleges don't offer any kind of DevEd, in that way, then it's where are they going to go? And they need this to develop, to make up this content and skills gap. And I think this is an important thing for policymakers to understand and know, right? Because AB 705 is an entire policy that's infecting all the community colleges in California, but as has come up in the chat earlier, it's depending on where you are in the state, the high school quality does vary. So, community colleges are being impacted by this single policy, but how they experience and what kinds of supports students need does vary based on the communities that you're in. And so that was something that we heard in our interviews and kind of speaks to this logic. Again, sort of talking about this kind of sequential thing, there was this sense that a sort of belief that, students really need to master basic skills and DevEd courses are providing the space for that. And it could be like in the math sense, like, you know, you need arithmetic to do algebra in order to do calculus, and so forth. But there was also like from some, we did hear from some English faculty thinking about like how that one level below course in particular was really necessary to develop some of the kind of college readiness and socialization and student skills that would be expected in English 101. And then finally, while there was less data around this, but a couple of the participants also talked about, again, the need, like kind of connecting DevEd like to students' ability to get these kind of high impact or jobs like down the line. And in this case, like one instructor noted that even to take something called a Super C test, it's like you do need to have some math skills, right? So there was a sort of idea that if students don't have the kind of this basic foundation, they may not even be able to take those skills and get that job down the line. So moving on to the next logic around educational opportunity. And I think this is, sort of this we kind of saw across like all of our interviews, this idea that, again, community colleges, it's open access, sitting in a stratified system of higher education where 4 years, for example, like do select for admission, the community colleges are for everyone, whether you're quote unquote ready or not. This one academic senate leader talked about community colleges being the last bastion of social justice. And, it is a place where, you don't turn students away. And so if they need DevEd, we need to be able to offer that to them. So that was like one of the ways in which DevEd and educational opportunity got linked together. And then kind of getting into what I noted earlier, that rationale around preventative medicine. And DevEd is kind of, it's needed to help students thrive and survive like in college courses. And sort of this idea that, DevEd, like not having DevEd can shame students into thinking that they, that there's not a place for them, that, it's not okay to not be ready for college. And so we have this one instructor who is noting that, AB 705 could be a little dangerous for students who haven't had the opportunity to master those basic skills, presumably from K to 12, and it could make that first class, if they're placed into transfer level, abnormally hard, right? So in a way, like DevEd is a way of harm reduction, in this person's like rationale. And then in the second quote, it's sort of like this idea, like not having it is sort of signaling that it's not, again, not okay, that it's sort of shaming students into feeling that if you're not up to that quote unquote college level, that you don't, you shouldn't be here. And so finally, the last logic is around choice. And this, as we saw earlier with the graph, like this in a way, choice, especially around student choice, was like the most frequent response that we saw, or that we were able to discern from the interviews. And I'm going to point, I think, in particular to, let me see. Yeah, so to the quote that's in the middle from the counselor. And this we heard, like, from a number of the counselors, it's like, hey, listen, our job is really to provide students like with the various options. So even under AB 705, it's like, yes, we would, direct placement is sort of the encouragement on the policy side. But the counselors we interviewed were very clear that it's like, we need to provide students, again, with all of their avenues. And that could include, like, if they wanted to take DevEd, that they should have that as an option. And that ultimately it was really their choice, about how they wanted to kind of move through the pathways, like through college. The final quote is also worth pointing out, and notably, this is a staff member who was very embraced AB 705, was very happy when it showed up. But even the staff member was like, and it's the purview of the faculty, to think about curriculum, right? And so like to remove the faculty's voice from thinking about whether, you can offer DevEd and how many levels below is, in their words, like a mistake in policy implementation. So where this is, I know we're also running out of time, so sort of where does this leave us in terms of conclusions? I think one of the major takeaways that we've had is that, yes, AB 705 has led to a number of changes, like to comply with the policy. but it hasn't meant that people have lost a taste or a desire for developmental education. What that means under AB 1705, I mean, I think that's a conversation and a question that that we would love to kind of talk with folks about, and kind of seeing like, how do you wrestle with this desire for dev ed, but basically not, you know, there are very few conditions under which you can actually like offer developmental education. And we think it's really important, I think, particularly for reformers who don't work at colleges, to understand this, like to understand that, you know, there are, you know, sort of longstanding practices are really difficult to change. And it's possible that, you know, there aren't enough resources, for example, supports, in order to do this kind of shift, to go alongside like with the mandate. And so that was like one of the things that, you know, one of the reasons why we felt compelled to do this analysis is really to understand the practitioner's point of view, again, as a way of hopefully prescribing, or at least sort of offering further guidance, like for policymakers and reformers who don't fully understand, you know, all the kind of opportunities and constraints that practitioners have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. And to understand, you know, maybe there are other beyond mandates, like are there other kind of resources that could be provided, professional development, et cetera. That's sort of like what this final slide really kind of outlines, and that they're questions. I think one of the things we also learned from talking with folks is that, you know, everyone is committed to student success. Like that was clear across the board, whether or not you were for or against AB 705. And what we're confronting are questions about, like, you know, how do you make this commitment real, right? And how do you ensure that students are, you know, completing, that they're learning, you know, that they're getting, you know, that they're graduating and that they're getting these jobs, you know, and having the socioeconomic mobility that community colleges are really good at providing. I already talked about, like, yeah, needing like more resources and supports. And that I think just like a final thing is that, and this is sort of like a side finding, is that, you know, you're going through a lot of changes and a lot of reforms that are coming like from either the chancellor's office or the legislature. And that for us is just a question, like, you know, how conducive is this kind of constant state of reform to enacting transformative change, you know, going forward. All right, so I'm going to end there. Okay, and I'll stop sharing as well.
Thank you so much, Cheryl. If I didn't really see any specific questions for this presentation. There are a few like statements and questions that I think might be good for the panel discussion later, such as about enrollment decline and, you know, the shift K-12. So I think we can save those for the panel. But if you have any last questions for Cheryl, feel free to chat them and I'll pose them. Yeah, I think as a quantitative researcher, I really appreciate this kind of research. It's also very challenging and hard because you're kind of navigating and sifting through really, you know, beliefs and ideologies and emotions in a sense. And so it seems important to name and identify these logics, right?
Yeah.
My main, I guess the one question I have for you is, you kind of alluded to some potential recommendations at the end, but I guess have you seen cases where these logics are kind of addressed?
Right. I mean, I would say like not in the context of AB 705, but I think in general, I mean, again, I think the folks who are in this meeting know better than I. I mean, again, there's been a lot of equity and student success work that has happened over the last 10 years at least, probably more, probably constantly. And so like when I was a graduate student, I was affiliated with the Center for Urban Education at USC. And so that was a set of projects in which, you know, we worked like with colleges that invited the center to come and work with them around questions of racial equity in particular. And so those were always spaces, and those are really interesting spaces in order to see like how, like through, I think, really local level, practice level research, you know, looking at your own data, looking at the course success data that was talked about earlier, and trying to think about like, you know, what am I doing or not doing that is resulting in these outcomes by race and ethnicity for my students. And what I have seen like through that work is, again, I think bringing it closer to practice. This is why I had the question earlier for you, Frederick, around, could you take the analysis that you did and make it campus specific? Because I think that's certainly been one of my takeaways from that work is like the closer you make it to your local conditions, like I think that's where you might start having wheels that are turning and really kind of thinking about your students, like sitting in your classroom or on your campus. So there's been some kind of, I think, positive results out of that, but it requires time. It requires like long investment. It requires resources, whether again, time, monetary, et cetera. And so I think that's one of the things, like I know, AB 705 did not come with any funding specifically for it, for the implementation. I don't know if I'd say, was that a good decision or not, but I think what is clear is that there needs to be something to accompany in order for there to be at least a critical look of how things are being done and seeing if that might shift some of people's beliefs.
Yeah, I think we can take these two quick questions. Well, not necessarily quick, but how much does instructor sentiment or logics contribute to student success?
Yeah, so we don't have that data. We don't have course level data on let's say, just thinking about the instructors who we interviewed, we don't have that. So we wouldn't even be able to make any kind of association one way or the other. But that is, that's an empirical question, and that's an empirical project that an instructor, like if they wanted to, could take that up, let's say. But I would say it would have to be voluntary, right? Like you shouldn't mandate that. But yeah, so we don't have, I couldn't answer that question for you.
Empirically, that's very challenging.
Yeah.
Maybe if you have a comment or two about disciplinary differences between math and English. Yeah, so
I think I would say we ended up interviewing, I think, a few more. I would say, did we interview more math? No, actually, I think it was pretty equal. I would say like the English faculty were more kind of middle positive on AB 705. The math faculty, I think there was a range. There was like super on board to yikes, what is this? So I think that might be one set of disciplinary differences. But again, our sample is really small, so I wouldn't necessarily infer too much out of that. It's just based on the people that we spoke with. I think part of it too is, let me try and think, like, is this relevant for the question? Yeah, I think also like math is, I think, just perhaps like a more complicated set of, like, because like you have two pathways. I think like with English, if I'm not mistaken, there was a sort of general consensus to move towards direct placement into 101 with like a number of kind of forms of recommended concurrent supports. And that in math, that was not like, yeah, that was maybe less so like of a thing. So that might be two ways in which like there was so there was kind of differences in placement guidelines and then differences in, sort of regard for AB 705. But I would say like across the board in terms of the logics, they were sort of like across the place, sort of across the board. So people were sharing. We didn't notice any discernible differences like between the two.
I think in the interest of time, I'm gonna move us to the panel, but there is a great question from me about department chairs and leaders addressing beliefs. I think some of that is in our survey report, actually, which I just linked. And then there's a great question about like students' surveys or interviews to kind of triangulate and assess from the other side. So we currently don't have a continued funding to look at students specifically and their experience of AB 705, but I think that's a very important research area. All right, so Tatiana, we can move to the panel.
So thank you so much, Frederick and Cheryl, and thank you for all the participants for sharing your point of views and asking questions directly to the presenters through the chat. That has been the preferred format. So Deborah, I am going to pass it on to you so you can.
Hi, everybody. I do want to call out the comment our Associate Vice Chancellor just made. I mean, I think we do have to start thinking about as a district, how do we address, how do we more deeply engage in dialogue about these logics, and talk with students. And I think, regardless of funding, for you all, that is something that there are plenty of us in this district, I think, who have experience with qualitative research, who could band together to do some of this work. So that's just me in my role of Dean of Student Success saying, if you all are interested in exploring things like that, we should talk about it further. I am here to moderate a great panel, a panel of practitioners. So we've heard from our researchers, and now we're going to hear from the people on the ground. Our panel consists of 3 people from LACCD and a couple of we have Vice Chancellor of Educational Programs and Institutional Effectiveness, Nicole Alba-Lopez, joining us. We have Professor Eddie Churchin, who is from the math faculty at Pierce and has been quite involved in the task force we have for AB 705. He leads that effort. We have Professor Claire Norris, who's an English professor from West, who is also a department chair there and has equally been involved with both of them. Both Eddie and Claire are involved with our English and math councils. And we have Professor Jim Stigler, who I'm personally appreciative of, as he was on my dissertation committee. And hey, I passed. Anyway, he is, go Bruins. He is an expert actually in the study of looking at teaching and learning practice, particularly how students in like math. And then we have Tatiana, our USC colleague, who I think will provide some great insight based on these many years of work with LACCD. So we're going to start with a couple of questions that we're going to have the panel address, and then hopefully have you all put questions into the chat so we can engage you in the dialogue as well as things occur to you. So the big question that we're going to start out with that everyone's going to answer is, what do you think are the key issues that emerged during the pandemic that colleges in the district had to address and are continuing to address? And we're actually going to have Dr. Alba-Lopez kick us off.
Thank you, Deborah, and nice to see everyone here today. As a district, I believe that one of the largest challenges that we encountered was, reaching our students in a remote environment and being able to provide those wraparound support services, especially when it came to providing tutoring. We found that we had tutoring services in our reading and writing centers and our math centers, where students typically had come in person and worked in small groups, and now figuring out how to fill that gap was a challenge for the district. And I think we've done okay in that realm. And I think we've come up with some interesting workarounds to be able to continue to support those students. But I think that that's definitely an aspect that was a challenge that emerged in the pandemic for our district.
Please chime in, Eddie, and then Claire, and then we'll have Jim and Tatiana.
Yeah, thanks so much, Deborah. I could not agree more. I think the sudden change in modality really disrupted the way things are done. At Pierce College in particular, we went in the math department, a lot of our AB 705 implementation supported, included tutoring support, as Vice Chancellor Alba-Lopez mentioned. We didn't go the path of prerequisite courses, but instead we really upped our tutoring, and we had some really strong numbers pre-pandemic of supporting students through those various ways. And the sudden change in modality, the lack of technology that some students had, created an access issue at first. And then it really took a while for some of these structures as well to really adapt and do their best to serve their students. So I don't want to be too redundant here and repeat what she said, but I think that that's a very valid point as far as peers went.
Claire?
Hi, everyone. Yeah, I would echo what the Vice Chancellor and Eddie said about tutoring, certainly. The LACCD's English Council kind of got together after, everyone's attention went from AB 705 to the pandemic. And then once AB 1705 came along, our attention swung back. And we put together some recommendations, and tutoring, increased support for tutoring, especially since our colleagues and learning centers have put so much energy and effort into the multimodal tutoring. And now there's still some questions about like how much they can offer online versus in person, what's required, the rate of pay for tutors. And so I think that that's a critical resource for students in light of all these changes. We also talked about, like Eddie mentioned, technology and the fact that immediately, the colleges were had all these laptops to loan to students, but students still need that technology, and those laptops ran out a long time ago. So that's a concern that was raised by English faculty members in response to the pandemic, and now kind of back focusing on the legislation.
All right, Jim, we'll take it away.
Well, the pandemic was very, very difficult, and but I want to focus on one of the positive things out of the pandemic, which is it's very hard. Nobody wants to change. It's very hard to get instructors to change pedagogy or content. Well, in the pandemic, guess what? No choice. Everybody had to change. And so one of the things that happened is people learned how to do things they thought they could never learn how to do. And I think it gives us a different sort of universe of possibilities moving forward for what might be possible with instruction and pedagogy. So I know it's hard, but I also think there might be some real opportunities there.
And Tatiana?
Yeah, so similar to my fellow panelists, I think that this was a great opportunity for faculty and leaders to really adapt. And California was very unique in their response, like similar to the LAUSD. The focus was to protect the students and the communities, to provide the basic needs, to provide the technology, to provide the hot spots, and also to provide the professional development support through 3CSN and multiple other professional development organizations for faculty to transition as smoothly as possible to these major changes. I think the pandemic changed us for good, and it showed us that we can do a lot remotely. So similar to what we're doing here today. So one thing, as we always try to do, is take the pulse of what is going on. So we started working with the district to really understand and design a project to see what did we learn from these abrupt changes in terms of mode of delivery and technology. And we saw a lot of innovation. We saw faculty like jumping into hybrid. We saw faculty using asynchronous. We saw some colleges going into what we call using high flex portable technologies. And we saw even some colleges using funds to build in cameras and the technology necessary to provide really high quality high flex. So all this, it's emerging, it's at the beginning, but it's a great opportunity for researchers to hear from the faculty, to hear from the students, and identify which would be the right amount of like hybrid versus in-person that students need. And this, I'll finish here, but this is also partially related to enrollment, because colleges have now to give the students the level of engagement that they want to have after the pandemic.
So let's dig a little deeper in thinking about teaching and learning as we move forward out of this time period. What do you think? And I do want to hear particularly from Eddie and Claire. What do you think we have to pay attention to, and what have we learned from our COVID experience? And what do you see going forward?
I can start. One of the things, like connecting with what Tatiana said, that the English Council included in our recommendations was around professional learning, of course. One thing that we noticed during the pandemic in particular and related to online learning, and then also, you know, before the pandemic and now, is kind of an uneven implementation of certain skills in faculty members, particularly equity-minded practices. And we feel like, you know, students deserve universal access to those equity-minded practices. And so we really want to see a prioritization of professional learning for faculty around equity-minded practices, and continued, of course, around technology too, but with kind of a shift in prioritization of the technology toward other like high impact, like data-driven practices. We also talked about like about data. And so, you know, looking at the presentations earlier, I really thought about our discussion in the English Council about the kind of data that we would like to see that could help inform our teaching, and things like assessing some of those logics that were presented that are ever so familiar to me, that I've heard many, many times. And I kind of presented them as like hypotheses that are presented by practitioners and folks who are really concerned about student success and concerned about the legislation and the impact on students and on faculty, and like really using research to assess those hypotheses to kind of give us the tools to really have a better understanding of like a student perspective, which is what I would love. So Deborah, count me in. And then we also talked about communication with students around the law. We had some concerns about like how that making sure students know their rights. So in the way that we make sure we're following AB 1805, and making sure that that's consistent across the district, so that students come into our classes like empowered and knowledgeable about what their rights are, so that we can connect with them on that level.
Yeah, I could not agree more with most of what Claire said, especially the professional development piece really, really resonates. I think she's spot on in that assessment 100%. I would add to that, you know, I really think the instructor's role continues to redefine itself, right? Which is normal in education, but even now more so than ever, I think going all the way down to the classroom, how we teach and how we go about lesson planning and how we go about the day has changed completely. Whether that involves some of those equity-minded practices that Claire touched on, whether that involves redefining our role to be that of a more of a facilitator or a coach, or a body of support in ways that we're not used to thinking about, perhaps pre-pandemic, whether that involves dealing with an ever-changing population. I think my colleague, our DAS president, Angela Chiveri, several times in the chat pointed out that we're seeing a lot of transition in the K-12 world as well, which is obviously impacting us directly as well. So we really, our role continues to redefine in various ways through various sources. So adaptation is really the name of the game to me. It's been a how do you adapt so that your students, our students, right, get the most of their college experience, and we provide the best possible service we can for them during what's without a doubt the craziest times in decades, probably, right, that we've seen. And a lot of it is the professional development piece that Claire spoke about. A lot of it is the collaboration and constant communication, the revision of data that she mentioned as well, and trying to practice data, you know, trying to make data-driven decisions as much as possible. But really, when it comes down to it, it's our why, right? To me, it always comes back to our why. Why is it that we're in this gig? Why is it that we're doing this? And it's really to help our students. So we just have to ensure that we continue to adapt.
So I'm curious, Jim, from your perspective, as someone who studies teaching and learning, what do you think we ought to be paying attention to as we move forward?
Well, I agree with everything Claire and Eddie said, but I also think that one thing we need to do is broaden our focus from just throughput, which I understand is important, to learning what students are actually getting out of these courses. Because if we really want to improve teaching and we're only focusing on throughput as the outcome, we may end up improving teaching in ways that don't really help our students improve their flexible, transferable knowledge, their access to career opportunities, and so on. So I do think that's important. But another point I would raise is that we not look at just the pedagogy, but also the content that we're teaching. I think it was interesting to listen to the interviews. I think we make a lot of assumptions about what the quote basic skills are that everyone needs to learn. And sometimes they may not be basic anymore. Now, I mainly know about the mathematics part, but for example, the students need to learn how to factor quadratic equations. Nobody ever is going to need to do that again, but they are going to need to do other things like use algebraic notation to represent relationships in the world. And so one thing I noticed looking at these graphs is it's really great to get students into these co-requisite courses, but the content and the pedagogy of those courses is going to be really important. We're currently not seeing a big bump from enrollment in those courses, but rather than giving up, I think we ought to look more deeply at what's going on inside those courses and how could they be made more effective.
Thank you. Tatiana, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, kind of like similar to what Chancellor Rodriguez started us with. I think that as institutions and instructors, like the onus is on us. And when I think about the declining enrollments, I think that if we don't have students, like what is the role that we have as instructors and mentors? So I really think that this is a good opportunity for, have a conversation with the students and also understand their needs and provide that contextual pedagogies and use, when appropriate, the critical race theories and the pedagogical innovations that have been done, and that there's like really a lot of really good research out showing that it works for the population of students that we want to serve. I also appreciate, in the case of USC, that our students have pushed us like quite intentionally in a good way to broaden like our own training. I started my training as a very traditional economist and thinking about Gary Becker, and now, I really expanded my tool set, and I became much more comfortable with other very different worldviews. That doesn't mean that I have to kind of throw away all my economist way of looking at the world, but it's a way of complementing and being more in tune with the context of the students and the families that we serve.
I mean, I think, and I will say this as someone who still does teach English on the side. I mean, this has been an overwhelming time for everyone. And I do think that all of us want to make the kind of changes that we think best support and serve our students, but we have to think about in the day-to-day life of faculty members, just the enormity of working with students, and particularly in this time period. And I'm just wondering from your perspective, and I particularly want to hear from Nicole about this, what can we do to better support teachers as they try to make these kind of learn new things? I mean, it seems like, Amanda Ryan Romo has talked about it as a tutoring center director in the chat, that, we're all asked to make these efforts, but with not a lot of support. So what can we do? I ask you first, Nicole.
I think we're headed in the right direction, and that we're at least having the conversations. We're seeing a lot more collaboration across our faculty in providing support and training. sharing of ideas. But I think that the world has changed dramatically, at least, as an administrator, my day is no longer 9 to 5. It's, 9 to 9 or 10 or 11 or 12, depending on when something comes through. Our students' lives have changed, which has, impacted how we do our business. So I think, particularly in the faculty work, the drive to collaborate and to share information has been very strong in our district. I think we turned around in miraculous time. Everybody moving to an online environment provided the training necessary to ensure that we were providing our students with high quality education during a very tumultuous transition. But I think one thing I observed with our faculty was a change in support for students. I saw a lot more empathy. I saw a lot more willingness to flex deadlines and time. And I think that those things have stuck with us. And, the opportunity to continue this work and the studies that are taking place and seeing how our practices are impacting our students positively or negatively is going to guide the conversation as we continue to move forward. But I definitely think that this willingness to have increased collaboration across the faculty unit is remarkable.
So Eddie or Claire, you want to say, what support do you need? What do you think your faculty need? I mean, you're both chairs. So what do you see?
Well, I could certainly start and share that one thing we've discussed in the district math council as well as in the AB 705 task force meetings is, when we have rules such as the 3 strikes rule, right, where a student can only repeat a course 3 times and then they're kind of locked out of it. How do we support students that don't succeed the first time in their transfer level math course? And I see in the chat again, Angela is adding about the throughput rate being the only metric of concern. That could be a dangerous game to play, right? When we're looking at it based on what Jim was saying earlier as well, is we need to better measure learning. And I think that's where we need the most support. Then we're going back to the question at hand here. I think that's where we really need to figure out new ways to support our students that might have that opportunity to now jump into transfer level math and English courses, but at first they're not successful. And I think that that's a piece that we're all still trying to address. And, the combination of a global pandemic and new sequences and new modalities and everything just sort of combined together all at once has really made it difficult for us as practitioners to really focus on how do we get this done? How do we make this happen? As we mentioned earlier, there's been a lot of chat about professional development and a lot of conversations about ways to improve. But I don't know that as a practitioner, I could say, I need more help with technology, and that's going to be the key that's going to do it. Or I need more, equity-minded practice learning, that's going to be the secret solution, that fixes it. I do agree with Nicole that it's the collaborative piece that's the beginning, but we definitely need to just be continuously aware of all the, for lack of a better phrase, all the political aspects of it coming in and sort of all combining together. I wish I had more to offer, but really, I think it's something that we're all still trying to figure out.
What do you think, Claire?
Yeah, well, I agree with Eddie that it's a complex issue and that we will need many, many strategies to see a change. And, some of the things we've talked about, more support for tutoring, more support for professional learning, more support for technological resources. An issue that comes up regularly among English faculty is class size. We have the largest in the state as far as we know when we talk about it. And I know, there's limitations on what the chancellor's office can help with. But those are some of the things that come up again and again among English faculty. And I will share my detailed list of recommendations again with you, Nicole, to make sure that you have it.
I'm curious, Jim or Tatiana, what have you heard other things that either faculty have expressed or better yet, what are students saying that they need? Any ideas about that?
I cannot really speak to that, but I want to acknowledge, comments in the chat, specifically from Angela. It's very kind of like recentering us and reminding us of the multiple and contradictory missions of community colleges. And I think in this conversation, we like and intentionally have been focusing on full-time students, and maybe some of the regulations and the guided pathways and the policies kind of are directing community colleges to focus on more traditional students, but we know that students have multiple demands and responsibility, and many of them can only enroll part-time. So I want to acknowledge that, and I want to link it again with enrollment and say that community colleges should not only focus on this traditional, and this is something for me that tend to think more on math and English, but what about the career, technical, and vocational? And we have seen leaders in community college districts across the state that have been quite innovative and have gone out to the communities and make connections with the industry to create the type of programs and certificates that the students need. So again, connecting the issue of enrollment and strategies to really get the students and offer the credentials and certifications that they need.
Yeah, Jim.
Well, mostly I was going to say I'm not in daily contact with community college students, so I certainly would defer to everyone else where I sit at UCLA. But I will say some of the best students at UCLA in my department, the psychology department, which is a very large major, come from community colleges. There's an incredible amount of talent out there. And so I can't help but thinking that somehow we're really capturing only a small percentage of the potential of the students that are out there. And other than that, we have different problems than community colleges, but definitely not the same ones.
So we have some questions in the chat, and I'm going to divert our attention over there from Ken Sori. Could our partners on the panel reflect on the data from the study about why so few students are availing themselves of concurrent support? Do you think there's institutional barriers, there's not enough offered, that may be getting in the way, rather than just student preference or choice?
I can speak to that, and I would invite Frederick also if he wants to complement. So as this is a great question, and as Frederick explained very clearly, we only have the transcript data to speak to that. We also have to remember that this is fall 2019. This is one of the only semesters that we have data pre-COVID, and this was just the beginning of the implementation of the policy. So there are so many confounding factors that makes it really hard to really have like a clear-cut answer related to take-up. But what I could say is that this finding is showing an opportunity for, for faculty and leaders to show that these resources exist and to invite students to take up this. One thing that I also learned from another project on providing basic income to students is that students don't read email. So we have to get very creative in terms of reaching out to them. We discovered that the only way, and I just want to elevate the work that Ellie did for that project, because she was like in constant contact with the students, texting them and engaging them where they were. So this would be kind of like my comments.
I don't know if anyone else has any ideas about that, particularly from LACCD.
I can add a little bit. So we at West, anyway, we offer our co-rec course online during the pandemic and since we've started coming back to campus. And so it's certainly not an issue of time of day, like whoever asked the question in the chat mentioned. I would like to know, what I thought of when I saw that question is to learn more about colleges that have more enrollment in their co-requisite options and find out what strategies they're using. I feel like I agree with Tatiana that it's a lot of it is a matter of communication. Students may not know about the course, don't understand what it is, maybe haven't met with a counselor. And so I would like to find out more strategies from those colleges and try implementing those.
And Maury wants to know, particularly, I guess, to Jim, can you touch on ways that we could measure learning in the community college environment? We are struggling with this, especially in relationship to questions about learning loss.
Oh gosh, that's a whole seminar on how we could measure learning. And a lot of it depends on what we think counts as learning and what's the kind of learning we want to measure. One thing I would say is the easiest kind of learning to measure is the sort of isolated procedural skills. And those are also the things that I think you lose as quickly through something like a pandemic, but they may not be the most important ones. In fact, in the research we've done with community college students, we find that what's missing is not a lot of the little bits, we call them, of skills that students are asked to learn, but the sort of coherence and interconnections of these skills with concepts. And that's really what leads students to have transferable and flexible knowledge that they can use to help them do better in a future course or to help prepare them for a career. And measuring that is harder, but it's not. The hardest part, I think, is sometimes political. So, for example, and I'm not at community college, but I talked to a lot of community college faculty. But if faculty got together and said, what do we really want students to come out of this course with? Can we come up with a set of common items and administer them to all of our students? This is an idea that's very much resisted in most community colleges, but it's really the only way to begin checking on whether you're achieving the goals that you all believe are important. So one of the things that I use in my class, for example, is, and I teach statistics at UCLA, is I always give the students on the final exam a question where they have to take what they've learned and apply it in a completely new area. I know I didn't teach them. And they say, we didn't get taught this. And I say, I know. I want to see if you can figure it out. And I really want my students to be able to do better in their future learning based on what they've learned in my class. But I think the first step is getting together a working group and defining, here's an item that if a student could do better at this at the end of the class than at the beginning, we all agree that would be fantastic. And then begin managing and your professional development and sharing of data and information around those items. I don't know if that's politically feasible, but I think it's really an important step in the assessment process, is figuring out what we want students to actually look like.
I'm reminded that there was an earlier comment that was made that Frederick suggested we have you as a panel. And so this is the comment. The fact that the LACCD has lost about a quarter of its enrollment since fall of 2019 indicates that the mission of community colleges is at risk and thousands of students are not being served. So I open it up to any of you to sort of think about that. Do you think that our mission is at risk and that drop in enrollment? How do we get those students back? Or what are your ideas about this? I would just add that there is a lot of, I've seen a lot of articles and things just talking about the fact that a lot of our community college students went to work and they had plenty of families, particularly, in supporting them, but, during COVID, many people, their parents lost their jobs. I mean, I know that there's a multiplicity of factors, but I think the issue is, why is community college still so necessary for them? And how are we going to get that message across and get those students back?
If I can jump in, I think that, you know, historically, we have ebbs and flows of when our enrollment goes up and down. The pandemic definitely changed priorities for households, and those that were attending community college had a shift in their priorities. And now's the time to kind of rethink, where do we go find them? Do we start knocking on the doors of employers and say, we'll bring education to you? So I think there's a multitude of ways that we can re-engage with our students. I know I've seen some messages in the chat regarding K-12. I think, providing that bridge for those students that have really struggled during the pandemic into community college versus, some that are not going to be prepared to go directly into the 4 years, another opportunity for us as community college educators and leaders to provide, that stepping stone for those students. So I do think that we have to rethink, no longer is that we've built it and they will come. We have to remind folks that we're here and go to them. And I think that, as I mentioned earlier, things are completely different than they were pre-pandemic. We're not operational 8 to 5 any longer. And so rethinking how we provide education is, as we move forward in a non-traditional sense, it's going to be key for us to continue our mission to serve our students.
Yeah, I could add to that. I agree with Nicole. I also think we need to really recognize that the value of the community colleges used to have in the system before is not as recognized anymore. I think that our students have other opportunities, whether it be private, whether it be jobs, as Deborah pointed out, and just the market, whether it be a decision driven by their priorities, simply their personal situation at the moment. But I think that our students are losing track of the value of community colleges and what they could bring to their educational career and their personal lives at the moment. And it's our goal to sort of, again, adapt. That is the name of the game. Without a doubt, for me, it's an adaptation, is to adapt and to make sure that we give them all the opportunities they need, whether that would be partnerships with local business, whether that would be, looking at our curriculum yet again and seeing what makes sense and what doesn't anymore in the world that we live in. It's certainly something that we need to discuss and to continue thinking about, because I do agree that our mission is being threatened, so to speak. And earlier, someone in the chat, and I apologize, I can't remember who it was, mentioned the interference of government, as far as the mission of community colleges goes. But we certainly don't want to limit ourselves in our offerings in that way either. If a student wants to take a geometry class at Pierce College, just because geometry happens to not be a transfer level math course, they should be prohibited from doing that, right? And geometry is something that's been around for many years, and it's a great stepping stone to other math courses, and it's something that they should have access to. But that's, again, going to the political aspect and not the point of why we're here today, since it's a more of a 1705 related topic and not a 705 related topic. But really, just to wrap up, I do believe it's reconsidering our goals and how we serve our students, because I don't think they see the same value that they used to in the past.
So to end on a note of thinking about why we're here today is how can potentially research for practice and practice for research help us particularly engage the students and help them move forward on their paths? What do you see as the benefit of the RPP model? And examples would be great. And I know that Eddie and Jim have examples.
Yeah, I guess I'll kick it off, and Jim, please feel free to add. But we had a great collaboration with Jim and Karen and their entire team at UCLA, as long as some colleagues at CSULA that have joined efforts on creating something we refer to as the Better Book Project. And this came right at the time of 705 implementation, and it was just a great way to talk about learning the way Jim described earlier, about the comprehension between these bits or these topics that you take in a statistics course. This is regarding a statistics program. And Pierce has worked with Jim's team in the past. We have some great experiences working with them in the past, doing some math research. And of course, we jumped right on this because, to me, it was exactly the spirit of 705. It was exactly personifying what this new statistics course could look like. And stats is the perfect home for this because, it's really a course that can live in many departments, but the way we teach it in math is precisely the way, and again, I'm only speaking for Pierce College here. I can't speak for the entire district, but it's the way that sort of Jim and the team had sort of envisioned, which is making these bits more comprehensible and connecting information together, connecting the bits to form long-term learning instead of a short-term mimicking, right? Which is oftentimes what occurs at a math course, unfortunately, right? The way it started at a high school level, usually, or even at a community college level. So it relied heavily on technology, and then that was actually staying modern and staying up to date and piquing students' interest. That's what we found out is we were really worried about the technology aspect of utilizing Python and R. It's actually mostly R. Python is really not involved here, but and it was something we worried about initially, but something that proved to be actually a benefit because it piqued student interest and kept them engaged in the curriculum. And again, it goes back to Deborah, to go back to Deborah's question, the gist of it, it's having that sort of collaborative space where you have researchers, educators, working together and combining their efforts to come up with curriculum, or in this case, a textbook, right? An interactive online textbook that's free to use and that's adaptable to any LMS, really was key in seeing how these changes driven by 705 were being implemented here. So we had the professional development piece, we had the direct feedback. So community college instructors would work with Jim and his team and suggest recommendations for change right away. And the authors of the text would, adapt that and sort of, change the textbook as we went along. So really, I want to let Jim speak to it more because I'm only touching on the surface here, but I'm sure he has more to add.
Well, I could talk forever about this, but I will say it's a very gratifying project to work at that level of detail. I've been involved in a lot of research practice partnerships, and sometimes the relationship between the researchers and the practitioners is more like they meet every now and then and report on their experiences. This is very different. It's really us all in the trenches together, taking this common instructional object, an interactive textbook, and trying to improve it. So we have researchers working together, but it's very gratifying for the researchers because when we discover something that can make the book better, we immediately can implement it. And then we have these instructors who are there immediately appreciating that we were responsive to the problems that they had identified. So I think building research practitioner partnerships around implementation of specific curriculum materials is a really fruitful opportunity direction to go.
So in the interest of time, I want to thank the panelists. I also want to say that I put in the chat the link to an opportunity to join a community of practice around for STEM instructors, and it's a partnership 3CSN does with UC Berkeley. And even though it says this, Friday is a priority deadline, you have until December 9th if you're interested in joining. So I would ask you to check it out. And Tatiana, take it away. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Deborah, for moderating the discussion. And I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Elise Swanson, who's going to be describing briefly the 2 new projects that are going to be part of the Research Practitioner Partnership.
Thank you, Tatiana. Yes, I'm really excited to share details of 2 new projects that are about to come online. So the first is called Leveraging Technology and Engaging Students, or LIGHTS for short. And this is a partnership between LACCD, the Center for Education Policy Research at Harvard, where I'm currently situated, and USC as well. So we've got a few PIs. This has been funded by the Institute for Education Sciences for the next few years. And sort of as we talked about today, like enrollment has been a huge concern for LACCD and for other community colleges sort of nationally. And LACCD has really pivoted towards these sort of online and hybrid models. And so that will sort of be the focus of this study, where the goal is to try to document those responses and see how those responses are relating to student academic outcomes, sort of a range of student academic outcomes, including GPA and credit accumulation, as well as faculty outcomes, right? Like we sort of know intuitively that this is maybe having an impact on well-being and workload, but we want to try to dig in and document and understand that as well. And then provide sort of some guidance around, okay, how can we help students decide between these different learning modes, what's going to be the best fit for them, and sort of for colleges thinking about how many of these different types of courses to offer. And then the second study has been funded by the National Science Foundation. So there's more of a focus here on sort of the two different math pathways, BSTEM and SLAM, and trying to think about, you know, how are students sorting into those different pathways? What are some of the predictors of it? What patterns do we see, and sort of who is in these different types of courses? And then how can we sort of make sure that students have the information that would be helpful to them in deciding between these pathways? And, you know, if there is a student who is currently in a SLAM pathway, but is maybe interested in a career that would require more of BSTEM preparation, can we have some sort of boot camp that will help them sort of switch and be successful between those pathways? So that will be working specifically with Pierce and with Eddie. So those are sort of our two upcoming projects, and really excited to get to engage with folks over the next few years on these projects. I'll pass it back to Tatiana and Deborah.
So thank you so much, Elise. And I think we're at noon. We want to be mindful of people's time. I want to thank everyone again for supporting the partnership, collaborating with us, being ready to engage with this survey, data collection, engaging with the findings, and remind everyone that this is going to be, the recording is going to be available soon. And in the website, we have all the reports and policy briefs resulting from this partnership. And I give it to you, Deborah, to conclude.
Oh, I would just say thank you, everybody. And I hope you have a wonderful holiday season, and we'll get that information to you about where to find the recording for this and all the materials. Thanks so much.